The Euthyphro is another of the early Socratic dialogues, which takes place prior to the trial of Socrates as depicted in the Apology. The text focuses nominally on the issue of piety, what it is and how it relates to the divine. The work follows the elenchus formula of Plato's earlier works, where the give and take of the dialogue between Socrates and the interlocutor finds themselves unsure of their original position. However, the work doesn't reach a point of aporia, which is the point of realization of one's own ignorance, and instead can be thought of as an abortive attempt. The dialogue commences with Socrates encountering a friend named Euthyphro near the law courts, where they have both been having their preliminary hearings for their respective trials. Socrates admits that he is being prosecuted by Miletus for impiety, with much ironic praise for Miletus's motives, as per 3b. Socrates: he is saying strange things, my dear friend. At least that's how they sound when you first hear them. The man says that I am a creator of gods, and that, by creating these new gods, I have shown disdain for the old ones, and so his charge makes reference to these old gods. Euthyphro: I understand what he means, Socrates. It is because you so often publicly say that you are occasionally visited by some divine power. This is why he accuses you of giving new interpretations to the city's religious dogmas, and why he has come to court to slander you. He knows very well that the people will readily believe this sort of slander. Socrates then asks Euthyphro why he has been in court, and Euthyphro reveals that he has laid a charge against his own father for murder. Socrates reacts in shock, and ventures that it must have been a family member whom his father had killed, for most parents would otherwise never bring such a charge against their parent. Euthyphro retorts that it is a matter of justice, not kinship, as per 4b and c. Why do you find it illogical, Socrates, the fact that there is no difference between the murder of a relative and that of a stranger? One needs only examine the act thoroughly, only the act itself, and see if the murderer has acted justly or unjustly. Euthyphro's concern here is pollution, being the religious pollution that a murderer incurs as blood guilt. This pollution is incurred equally by those around the murderer and, by Greek custom, it cannot be atoned without the charge being brought to court, and then either the death of the murderer or their banishment from the city. Euthyphro goes on to describe the specific circumstances of the murder as per 4c and d. The person who was murdered was one of our paid employees, and when we were working on our farms in Naxos, we had him there with all our other slaves, working for a wage. One day, after having too much to drink and was drunk, he began a quarrel with one of our slaves and, in a maddened frenzy, killed him. My father immediately clapped irons on his hands and feet, dropped him into the very deep ditch, and sent a man to Athens to ask a religious authority what should be done next. In the intervening time, before the man returned from Athens, my father took no care of the slave and neglected him totally, reasoning that he was a murderer and he did not care if the man died there. And this, in fact, what happened, Socrates. Hunger and the cold, as well as the weight of the irons, resulted in the poor man's death before the man my father had sent to Athens had returned with the interpreter's answers. Socrates feigns ironic amazement at Euthyphro, and, when Euthyphro states proudly his competence in such matters of the divine, Socrates begs to be made his student. It should be noted that such proud statements are always a sign of an interlocutor soon to be humbled throughout the elenchus process. Socrates then posits that if Euthyphro is truly worthy of his pious reputation, he should be able to give a working definition of piety. Euthyphro enthusiastically answers this in 5d and e. What I call pious is what I am doing just now, taking to court the criminals either because they committed murder or have stolen from holy shrines or done other such things, whether they happen to be your father or your mother, or if he is your relative. As for the impious, impiety is not to do this, not to bring the criminal to justice, and not to seek his punishment. Yet Socrates is not willing to let this answer pass. Firstly, he asks ironically whether the popular depictions of the gods are to be believed, with all their jealousy, hatred, and violence. Euthyphro emphatically affirms these stories, and many more, that they are true. Socrates, as with so many of these other Platonic dialogues, finds fault with this overly specific definition. By this I mean that even if the answer was a truly pious act, it is only one such example of piety, not piety in and of itself, as in 6d. So please remember, Euthyphro, that I did not ask you to explain to me the pious nature of one or two of the many things that are pious, but to teach me clearly what is the nature of that which is pious, a nature which all pious things have and which makes them pious. Euthyphro then attempts again to produce a workable definition of piety, this time describing piety as what is loved by or dear to the gods, while impiety is what is hated by the gods. Socrates then rebuts Euthyphro using his previous admission of the truth of strife and disagreement amongst the gods. If, as Euthyphro affirms, the gods sometimes disagree amongst themselves about the questions of justice, some things will be both loved by some gods and hated by others. By this definition, these things will be both pious and impious, which makes no sense. As per 8b, consequently, Euthyphro, what you are doing today, that is, prosecuting your father, could well be loved by Zeus, but hated by Cronus and Uranus, loved by Hephaestus, but similarly despised by Hera. In both this and the previous definition, we appear to see an allusion to Plato's later argument in such works as the Republic that the poetic conception of the gods, so human-like in their desires, hatreds, pettiness and immorality, is falsely slanderous of the divine, which, as he describes in the Apology, could not commit falsehood as it was not in their nature. Pressed further, Euthyphro is led by Socrates to put forward a new answer which accounts for those times where the gods disagree. The new definition stands as thus: piety is what is loved by all gods, impiety is what all gods hate. Here Socrates grips onto this definition to get to the heart of the dialogue. He poses the question, do the gods love piety because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? This rather tricky proposition is put forward in 10e to 11a. However, Euthyphro, if that which is loved by the gods and that which is pious is the same things, if, in other words, the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, then that which is loved by the gods also would be lovable. If, however, that which is loved by the gods is so because it is loved by the gods, then the pious too would be pious because it is loved by the gods. But now, you see, these two things are opposites because they are totally different. Because the one, because it is loved by the gods, it must be lovable, whereas the other is lovable because it must be loved. This piece of the text is somewhat convoluted, but to better grasp the point of the question, consider a similar example. Is a flower beautiful because it is admired by people, or is it admired by people because it is beautiful? Socrates is arguing that by mistaking the action, admiration, for the cause, beauty, we are getting things the wrong way around. People admire the flower because it has an intrinsic property, the property of beauty. This beauty is what causes us to admire the flower. Similarly, things aren't pious because gods view them in a certain way. Rather, the gods love pious actions, such as helping a stranger in need, because such actions have a certain intrinsic property, the property of being pious. Please note here, I'm not necessarily agreeing with Plato, however, I believe this is the point that he is exactly putting forward. Socrates then walks Euthyphro up to the point of agreeing that piety is part of justice, and that he must now describe which part of justice piety is, and Euthyphro puts forward that it is piety is the part of justice concerned with caring for, or in some translations, tending to, the gods. However, Socrates objects to this notion of tending or caring as it is unclear. Clearly, humans cannot care or tend to the gods in the same way they would care or tend to a horse, a dog, or a child, where the guardian seeks to improve their ward, as per 13c, and so piety, which is tending to the gods, is aimed to their benefit, and it makes them better. And have you ever thought that whenever you are committing an act of reverence, you have actually made some god better? Euthyphro: never, by Zeus, that I have never thought. Socrates then puts forward an alternate solution. Perhaps the care a person shows to the gods is similar to the care a slave shows towards their master. However, if it's like the care an enslaved person gives to their enslaver, it must aim for some definite shared goal, as per 13d and e. Socrates: now tell me, what sort of tending to the gods is piety exactly? Euthyphro: the sort, Socrates, which the slave shows to their masters. Socrates: I understand. A sort of service tendered to the gods, it seems. Euthyphro: Exactly. Socrates: So can you tell me now, to what ends is this service of doctors aimed at? Surely you'll agree that it is aimed at the betterment of the health? Euthyphro: I do indeed. Socrates: What of the service of shipbuilders, Euthyphro? To what end is their service aimed at? Euthyphro: That is obvious, Socrates. That service is aimed towards helping them build ships. Socrates: And that of the builders of houses? I would think that their service helps them build houses. Euthyphro: Yes. Socrates: So, my excellent friend, Euthyphro, now tell me, this service to the gods, to what end is it? At this point, the dialogue has reached its climax, and Euthyphro and Socrates appear to be on the cusp of a breakthrough. However, at this point, Euthyphro blinks and gives a rather pedestrian answer in 14a through b. It was not long ago that I told you, Socrates, that all these things were very hard for one to explain with any precision, but let me explain them to you in general terms. If a man knows how to speak well and behave well towards the gods when he prays and when he conducts sacrifices, all these things are, as I say, pious, and they will benefit both their own house as well as the common affairs of the city. All things that are opposite to these pleasing things, however, are impious, and overturn and destroy everything. This rather abortive response can be summed up as piety is saying and doing what is pleasing to the gods at prayer and sacrifice. Socrates now berates Euthyphro for hiding the answer and now spinning the argument in circles. He interrogates the answer further and finds it merely to be the third definition, but in disguise. Piety is what is loved by all the gods. Socrates begs Euthyphro to begin the process of examination again, but at which point Euthyphro dodges the conversation completely in 15e. With pleasure, Socrates, but some other time. Right now, though, I must hurry to go somewhere. I must leave now. This particular dialogue has spawned a problem called the Euthyphro Dilemma, which has troubled theologians throughout the ages. If we take for granted that God, or gods, exist, and we accept that piousness is an attribute which an individual can possess, being that which is loved by the gods, then it is the pious loved by the gods because they are pious, or is the pious pious precisely because they are loved by the gods? This presents a unique set of problems to the monotheistic faiths of the Abrahamic family, which portray God as omnipotent. From one angle, if the faithful accepts piety as being dependent upon the love of the divine, then several problems appear. Firstly, there can be no rational reason for believing in God's will, since there are no moral standards other than God's will. If morality is ultimately not based on reason and arbitrarily dependent on God's will, then what objective measure can be used to measure the goodness or evil of any one action? Furthermore, if we cannot measure God by objective moral standards, how can we possibly describe God as good or wise? From the other side, if the believer states that piety is not dependent on the divine, they are asserting that a set of objective standards must exist prior to, or at least separate from, God. However, such an argument has severe theological implications. 1. God can no longer be thought of as omnipotent, as God did not establish moral truths, but is bound by them just like mortals. Furthermore, if God is absolutely good, then God must be absolutely bound to an independent set of moral standards, which also compromises the freedom of God. This also raises the question, if God is bound by these rules, then who was the rule giver, and surely they must have more power than this so-called God. Although this Euthyphro dilemma is interesting, and particularly important to monotheists, it sidesteps the issue at play within the broader dialogue. Right before the final definition, Socrates has guided Euthyphro to the idea that piety, if a form of care given as a slave cares for their master, must be towards a common aim. He has also led Euthyphro to the idea that piety is part of justice. I would argue that, although not explicitly stated, Socrates is leading Euthyphro towards the idea that the common aim of humans and gods must be the good, and that piety is pursuing goodness in one's life. Although less explicit than in later dialogues like the Gorgias and the Republic, the Euthyphro forces us to ask what the purpose of human life is, and, whether or not you accept the divine, by what measure we can ascertain the right way to act.